Ballad of Johnny Arcane by Jim Nail, read to you by Jim Nail. Chapter 13, In Between Land, Part 1. He developed a method of counting the passage of days. Every night before he slept, he picked up a pebble and dropped it in an empty corn oil jar. It was good to make a ritual, and it served a purpose. He could track the days he had walked and count the days until the morning of the fourth moon, when Lucy would be marching with the Blackcoats on the Onyx Highway to the flesh mills of Ironweed. On the day that there were 6 pebbles in the jar, the terrain changed abruptly. The forest opened up to a rocky, rounded slope dotted with the stumps of fallen trees, devoid of vegetation. The rocks and the stumps were bleached gray, and there was a faint odor of wet, dormant ash. Desolation haunted the place. In the sky overhead, a lone vulture circled. He was entering the in-between land, the border between the known world and whatever lay beyond. Johnny quickened his pace. He preferred the mystery of the forest to this barren hillside, with its wounds out in the open, scorched by the sun. At the summit, he looked down. There was almost nothing to see. Below him, the land spilled out into nothingness, an impenetrable brown haze, a screen of ancient smoke, obscuring everything, the sky, the sun, the earth. For a moment he began to believe what people said was true. Outside the known world, there was nothing. The known world was the only world. The fires had destroyed everything else. It filled him with dread. His heart throbbed in his chest. He sat down on a dead stump and stared into the void. His eyes followed the suggestion of a path winding down through outcropped rocks and low, scrabbly rabbit brush. The path soon disappeared into the vapors, but the longer he stared into the emptiness, the more details emerged. There were shapes in the distance. They could have been tors, they could have been towers. He wasn't sure, but visible as they were from such a distance, they had to be enormous. And there were places where the haze swirled in eddies and plumes of smoke rose into dreamlike shapes. He did not tarry. Whatever this new world was held in store for him, he was anxious to plunge himself into it. He surrendered to the downhill flow, and soon he was walking among boulders and bracken, the valley floor nowhere in sight. There was something in the air, a pervasive odor that did not shift like the other odors, the wood saps, the hidden water, the lingering essence of fire. It smelled a little like corn oil, a little like carbide. It was heavy, the heaviness of rain on the underbellies of dark clouds, darker, thicker than mist, thicker than vapor, suspended only by the stillness of the air. He came to a colony of burrowing rodents in a grassy field, their fresh dirt mounds everywhere. Sometimes they popped up out of the holes to stand guard on hind legs or scamper to another entrance. He sat still in the middle of the field and watched them, considering how easy it might be to catch one and how it might taste roasted. But then something else caught his attention. Rising above a rubble on the other side of the field, a cloud of dust, not a patterned cloud made by wind, more a gathering cloud stirred up by motion, by trampling or by large wheels or by many dancing feet. He forgot his hunger and let his curiosity lead him. The rodents scattered back into their holes as he crossed the field and scaled the rocks so as not to be seen by whatever was on the other side. A broad valley, completely alive with movement, spinning around a central eye. At first he could only discern the shapes of the swirling dust, not the creatures that made them. It was an imperfect circle. It veered wildly and fractured into rebellious sub-spirals, like ripples in a rocky stream. Eventually he began to see them. The shadowy forms in the dust, strange, strong muscular bodies, wild and willful, unrestrained, obedient only to the force of the movement itself, half-crazed, headstrong. Horses, black and brown, glistening coats of flashing manes. He recognized them only from the horse dolls on Jocko's shelf. But he never realized how strong they would be or how terrifying. The ground under his feet shuddered with the thundering of their hooves. They were singing, voices high and shrill, dissonant, angular melodies. Their pace was fast and frantic. Their circle swooned and wobbled, and at any moment he thought it might fly apart and he would be trampled. Then he saw the woman. She materialized out of a swirling cloud. She was running with the horses, keeping pace with them. As soon as Johnny saw her, he slipped behind a rock so as not to be seen, even though she was far away. She moved in and out among the horses. She disappeared and reappeared. Her dark hair was as wild as a horse's mane. She was naked, except for something dark tied about her waist. It was a kind of dance, and the woman was leading. She pressed herself into the fleet of their movements, and they shied away. In this manner she created the circles deliberately. It was a great task, for the herd was large, and those at the edges tried to break away and make for the open range. She ran ahead of their intentions and rounded them in, and the spiral kept drawing closer and more ordered, and the dust began to form a funnel. Then it happened. Briefly, the woman vanished behind the screen. When she reappeared, she had attached herself to one particular horse, the tallest of the lot, a black beast, who shrieked and thrust its ramrod head at her as if it meant to shove her to the ground. But she would not be toppled. She grasped the horse's flying mane. Suddenly her feet were off the ground. The horse reared, but the woman would not be thrown. She rode the upward motion and threw her legs over the creature's back. The horse kicked and bucked, but the woman straddled its body and held on tight, burying her face in its mane, her arms and legs twined like a deep forest vine. The black horse shrugged and shuddered, then came to a standstill in its tracks, as if surrendering to fate. The entire herd was making a sunward circle around it now. Horse and rider stood at the eye of a great whirlwind of dust and jostling bodies. Slowly the intention shifted. The movement began to turn inward. Horse by horse, the creatures stilled. Manes flashed and flanks glistened. Eventually calm fell on the plain, and as the dust settled, the entire herd stood silent in a circle, facing the black horse and rider in a stance conveying something that could only be named as reverence. The woman sat up to her full height on the black horse's back. She looked around, all around, in all directions, at all the horses. She said something to them, but the distance swallowed her voice. However, her next utterance reached Johnny's ears. It came with a sudden motion, a goading of her legs against the horse's broad flanks. She let out a shrill, horse-like cry. Hey-yay-yay-yay-yah! The black horse took off at a gallop. Immediately a corridor opened in the circle for horse and rider to pass through, and just as immediately it closed behind them as every other beast in the herd joined their flight. The gathered creatures moved with one common purpose: to follow their mounted leader forward, thundering across the plain, raising a cloud around them as if bound to a single thread. The ground trembled and the dust rolled. Soon Johnny could not see the horses at all, only a tumbling, amorphous form racing across the plain into some distant vortex. He sat on the boulder in stunned silence for a long time, for as long as it took for the dust to settle and the ground to stop trembling. A long time indeed. And during that time, his mind began to focus. The sun, a mere blotch of light, hung midpoint in the sky above the gathering dust. The horses had vanished into the west. The trail across the plain had been trampled to oblivion. On the other side of the plain, another range of low scrub hills hid the great hazy valley from his sight. But the air above the hills was smoky and discolored, and vaporous plumes rose and flattened against some invisible ceiling. Path or none, he sensed this was his destiny, to crack the mystery of this formless valley. It was more a premonition than a portent, more an omen than a promise. It placed a discomfort in the pit of his stomach. But also, he was hungry.